I'm William Stewart, co-founder of Telios. Welcome back to this verse-by-verse study on the book of Hebrews. I'm glad you're here. We're in an exciting chapter and section of that chapter in chapter 6, going through verses 13 through 15 today. So what we've been covering has been, since the end of chapter 5, an admonishment, an encouragement by the author to the young Christian Hebrews, telling them to mature, become mature. As it says in chapter 5, he's having to give them milk. They should be eating meat, spiritual meat, and they should be teachers by now and be able to judge swiftly between good and bad. So he tells them in chapter 6 to move on for the things of salvation, move on in their Christian walk. And if they're looking for something else to take away their sins or to make them think they're saved or to assure that they're forgiven, there is nothing else. In fact, if they are not looking upon Christ suffering, sacrifice on the cross, taking death for all men for all time, if they're looking for something more, that not only is it not there, but they're then asking Christ to sacrifice himself again, putting him back into public shame like he had to the first time. It's not a complimentary session by this author to the Hebrews. However, then he becomes encouraging, as the biblical authors do, admonishment balanced with grace, saying God will not forget your works. And of course, we've learned from other scripture that good works for the Christian comes after receiving Christ by faith alone in his death and resurrection, and receiving the Spirit and the regeneration that allows us to do those good works. So if you're a Christian, you demonstrate those good works, period, because you're a changed person. So God remembers that, and he knows who are his, and he then goes into a nice section, beginning in verse 13, which we're discussing today, on the security of our salvation. He says in verse 13 in the King James, "For when God made promise to Abraham, because he could not swear by no greater, he swore by himself." Now this comes from Genesis 22:17, after, excuse me, God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, and he took him to the altar on what is thought today to be where the Temple Mount is in Jerusalem. God stopped him right before the sacrifice, provided a ram, recognized his faith and obedience, and again repeated the promises to him that he had made. And basically, starting in Genesis 12, there are 3 promises to Abraham and his sons, Isaac and Jacob. He repeats them up till Genesis 35, that there would be a son, Isaac, to Abraham, I think as a sign that the other 2 would be fulfilled. And of course, God did not repeat this to Isaac or Jacob, because Isaac had been born, right? But at the fact that Abraham would be a blessing to all people, meaning he would bring Messiah, and would be father of a great nation, meaning Israel. This is the Abrahamic covenant. And really, all of Scripture is based on these 2 promises, the fulfillment of Scripture and God's plan. So they're really important. And the promises it speaks about in the epistles, as Walter Kaiser says from at Trinity for much of his career, Trinity Seminary, that the promise relates back to the Abrahamic covenant. So he swore. Why would he do this? Well, back then, Abraham was 4,000 years ago. They did not have written contracts. So what they had to do was that they would have a feast, and the verbal contract would be repeated in front of many witnesses. They would then take an animal, split it in 2, and both parties would pass between the animals signifying a pack. You might remember in Genesis 15, God cut an animal in two before Abraham, and only God went between the two, meaning that the contract was based on God out of his grace and not Abraham. Excuse me. Salt was used also as part of the contract, and swearing. Much like we did as kids, we'd swear on something to say that we'd really do it. Well, they did that back then in the hopes that if somebody wrote the contract, people would remember the swear and the cut animal and the salt and the feast, and remind the person breaking the contract what was right. So there's nobody greater for God to swear upon. He swore upon himself. So there was a promise and the oath by God. And this becomes important in a few verses. Saying, surely blessing, I will bless thee, and I will multiply, and I will multiply thee, and multiply, and I will multiply thee. And this is from the promise, repeating the promise to Abraham after the almost sacrifice of Isaac, the typing what Christ would do on the cross for us, in verse 17 in chapter 22. Verse 15, and so after he patiently endured, this is Abraham, he obtained the promise. We know Abraham lived a life of faith, and that was reckoned to him as righteousness, importantly, in Genesis 15:6. His actions justified or showed who he was. We learn from James 2, as Wayne Grudem nicely points out. Abraham's justified lifestyle based on his faith in God, as spoken about in James 2. So all this to say, importantly, is basis for us in our own belief. We believe by faith. God's faithful to his promises, and we're promised salvation. And he will make sure, not forgetting our works and who we are as regenerated, spirit-filled people, to take us home to be with him. Very important promises and lessons. He continues to expand on this for the rest of the chapter. Glad you were here today. Please join me for next time as we continue this important discussion. Goodbye for now.